If I have a health hazard, what assemblies can I use?
Well, if you have a health hazard, you can use the RPZ, you can use the air gap. On some of the irrigation and stuff, if it doesn't have back pressure on it, you can use your PVBs and SBBs.
What can we use a double check for?
Well, double check right now in the state of Texas, you can use a double check on your irrigation for non-health.
A lot of utilities or water purveyors, they have their records, and if they have backflow assemblies installed at a site, they generally feel like they're protected. If I'm a facility and I have a backflow assembly installed, does that automatically mean I'm protected?
Absolutely not.
Welcome to FLO Talk, Conversations with Water Professionals. I'm Travis Kvaal, Cross Connection Control Field Operations Supervisor for Hardin & Associates and Partnership Development Lead for FLO by HAC. In our last episode, Joel Klump helped us explore Pillar 2 of the 6 pillars of cross connection control, and that's discovery. We talked about one of the biggest challenges facing cross connection control programs, identifying assemblies that we don't know about in our system and aren't being tracked. Today, we're moving on to Pillar 3, protection. Finding an assembly is only part of the equation. Once you've identified that hazard, how do you know the right level of protection and how to get that in place in your system? Has the property changed over time? Has the hazard classification changed? Is the assembly installed today still appropriate for the level of risk it's intended to protect against? To help us discuss these questions today, I'm joined by Ron Moore. Ron has extensive experience in cross-connection control and water quality and has spent years working with utilities to help protect public health and strengthen drinking water programs. Ron, thank you for joining us today. Before we get started on today's topic, give us a little bit about your background, how you got into water and how you got into cross-connection control.
Well, I started in water in 1992 in February. And the funny thing, when I first got in the water business, I didn't realize I was going to like it so much. I never had done it. And then within the first year, I got my C surface, and within 3 years, I got my B surface. And of course, when you have a surface water plant and a large utility like we had, CrossCon is part of the everyday thing. We had multiple RPZs and double check valves at our surface water plant. And so originally started out doing a lot of repairs on those. We would repair them and then test them and stuff like that. So that's kind of where we started. I think that certainly helps with experience of doing the repairs. And then we would look at what needed what was the hazard. We learned a lot in the last 34 years from a lot of experience. We would learn, of course, if you've got a chemical injection, you need to put an RPZ on it. And we learned that you don't put it on multiple lines. You do one RPZ per injection. These are some of the things at the water plant. We once did a construction project, and when it was nearly finished, they had a cross connection with the clear wells, with the potable water with the settled water. And we air gapped that. Mm-hmm. The easiest way, Travis, just to cut the pipe and cap it off and never use it again. But you can't always do that, of course.
Yeah. So when we have a new assembly installed, or when we've got a new cross connection that we've got to deal with, when you see that new assembly, how do you know whether it's for the right hazard level or not?
Well, one of the first things we need to do is, like we talked about a little bit earlier, does it have an OSSF? Is it on irrigation? Is it on the domestic side of the meter? And exactly what is it, a commercial, is it a resident? Exactly what do we have going on, and where are the lines running? And this is where it's so vital to do our CSIs, and those kind of things are kind of preliminary on the CSI and kind of look around. Do we have a well on site? And there's a lot of things we see, especially in rural areas, and those kind of things, and then appropriate. Then you also have to look at the ordinance that the utility has, and you have to be up with the 290 rules and the RG rules that TCQ has currently. So those are some of the things that we look at and make sure that we have the proper assembly properly tested and installed properly.
Yeah, when we're talking about the proper assembly, if I have a health hazard, what assemblies can I use?
Well, if you have a health hazard, you can use you can use the RPZ, you can use the air gap,
Mhm.
and on some of the irrigation and stuff, if it doesn't have
Back pressure?
back pressure, I mean, yeah, thank you, back pressure on it, you can use your PVBs and SPBs.
Yeah.
It depends. Now, if you're on irrigation and you're going to pump in, you got an on-site sewer system, or you're going to pump in chemical injection, you're going to use RPZ.
Yeah. And so we see what we call double checks everywhere. Sometimes plumbers and sometimes some plumbers or some irrigators will just say a double check is a backflow, right? They won't even call it a double check. They'll call it a backflow, right? And what can we use a double check for?
Well, double check right now in the state of Texas, you can use a double check on your irrigation for non-health.
Hmm.
And some of the things that, and there again, it's going to depend on the ordinance, because I'm seeing a lot of ordinance in the DFW area here that are wanting, RPZs on there like everything. And you got to be careful there, because you'll choke the system down too much if you put too many RPs out there. So you kind of got to navigate that as you go. But usually they're not health. You're going to see for example, I've seen like in restaurants, let's say, like you got a coffee machine, you can put a double check valve on that if it's okay in the ordinance, of
Yeah.
some of the things that we do, that we see like on the CSI, or if we're installing or testing, that kind of stuff.
So, so simply, I can use a double check for non-health for both back pressure and back siphonage, right?
Yes,
And
sir.
then an RPZ I can use for back pressure, back siphonage, and a health hazard. Uh, PVBs and SVBs I can use for a health hazard, but only for back siphonage, not for back pressure.
Right.
And an air gap I can use anywhere that it's practical, right?
Yeah. I mean, we in the industry, we love air gap if that's possible, because if you don't have a physical connection, you don't have a cross con. But like you just said, the RPZ is one of the best things we can use out there.
Yeah. And what are some examples of places where you've been in the field and you've seen hazard levels that don't, the level of protection that's there doesn't match the hazard level?
Well, we see it a lot in when we do conduct the CSIs. We see a lot of that in the field. I've seen like large complexes, and they didn't realize, or the irrigator didn't know. They put a double check, and they would have an on-site sewer system in there. And so I would flag that, and they would put an RPZ in there and take care of that. That's one of them that we see a lot, like we talked about the on-site sewer system RPZs, or a lot of them we see like in restaurants, carbonators. They don't have, or another thing I see a lot of is they'll have an RPZ, but they got 4 or 5 machines in their restaurant hooked to it.
Mhm.
Then we got to go back and identify the health and non-health, and then split that up.
Yeah.
Can I say one of my concerns that I'm seeing right now?
Yeah.
Would be the large data uh, systems going in. Is you've got, for example, I saw one out in Abilene, had 8,000 employees, and it was huge. It was probably acres and acres, and it had water running, large water lines, 20, 30-inch lines. And it's really going to be hard to tell. Okay, for to protect the city, we can put an RPZ, out there, and that's fine. That protects the city. But I'm concerned with internal protection on those. I'm trying to figure out where all these lines. You got hundreds of computers hooked to water cooled, and they're recycling this water through chillers and everything. So there's a lot going on there. So that's some things I think we're going to need to look at in our industry in the near future as these data processing goes in. Because I've got one going in pretty close to us here.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like they're kind of going in everywhere. Have you seen situations where property has changed and maybe the level of protection was proper at one point, but it's no longer proper?
Yeah, I've seen some things like where, let's say, they added a swimming pool,
Hmm.
and then they need to put, cross connection, protection on that. And then I've also seen where they tried to do the swimming pool off of the irrigation, which is a
Yeah.
no. So that's another one you want to watch out there. They'll do that. I don't know if contractors, sometimes they just don't know, or they're trying to slip it. I mean, you never know, but we see those kind of things all the time. Or maybe they've done like a plumbing project, and they've added some stuff. Maybe they've added some of those bidets or water softener or something like that. That it's going to create a cross control problem out there.
Yeah, and then I think I've also run into like warehouses where maybe it originally was just a warehouse, and so it had a large double check valve on the domestic main, and then that warehouse space ended up being used for industrial, and so industrial equipment came in, and the level of hazard changed. Now we needed a an RP on that domestic line.
Well, see, and that can be problematic. And also, is when they do that, let's say maybe there was not anything there, and I did the CSI and everything looked good, and I said, okay, yeah, we can do that. And then let's say like a chrome plating moves in there, or a body shop or something where you're going to have contaminants and stuff. So, or a printing operation or something like that, where we know there could cross contaminate, or medical. A lot of times we'll see medical facilities move in there. These are all things that can be problematic. So, what we have to do is be sure the utilities know that when this is done, they have the right to do another CSI in there, internal CSI, and see what's going on and change the, you know, backflows as needed.
Yeah, and speaking to that, a lot of utilities or water purveyors, they have their records, and if they have backflow assemblies installed at a site, they generally feel like they're protected.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we do, Travis, as I do a lot of instructions, is we trying to teach the utilities, the operators, because they're the key. They're there every day and they're looking at these things, trying to teach them kind of what to look for and to go, oh, we have a problem here. We need to address it, and then how to address that. And so I think as we go, we become more educated. I know that TCQ people become the investigators, stuff become more educated. So, a lot of it's education and compliance, these kind of things.
Yeah, and utilities do have the right, like you said, to go back in and do those periodic CSIs to see if those hazard levels have changed, as long as they have the legal foundation in their ordinances or tariffs or customer service agreements.
Right. And this is why that when we do a service agreement, because I'm working on a utility, we're going to start doing, working on their service agreement right now. Right of entry is paramount. I mean that, and then to adopt the plumbing ordinance that they want to adopt, like UPC, IPC, those kind of things. It's just so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if a utility wanted to strengthen its protection and its program now, what are some practical steps they could take over the next year to ensure they have the proper protection levels for their hazards?
Well, one thing they could do is, they could look at, if it's a large city, especially, they could look at what was permitted. Did somebody permit to do some plumbing? Was a CSI conducted? And if not, do one. One of the, I did have a cross connection on a large city where it was improper storage of piping, and VOCs got into the water.
Oh, yeah.
And I worked on that. I won't tell you who the utility are, and they're very good, but they changed, and this cost millions of dollars. They had to do like a 14-inch that was 6, 8 feet below a road. They had to tear up that whole road and pull all that out and redo it. So, when I had talked to the supervisors, large city, we were looking at a estimated cost of $2 to $3 million by the time they were going to fix it. So the cities need to understand that a lot of times we can prevent this by working on our cross-con, effectively beforehand, instead of letting a problem become a problem. You don't want a massive problem like I've seen a city where E. coli was because of cross-cons popping up. And then, of course, you've got TCQ, you've got, the governor wanting to know what's going on. You got all this stuff going on, and it's costing a ton of money for everybody when that happens.
Yeah, and how important is your record keeping and knowing where all your assemblies are and knowing what those assemblies serve for your ability to quickly react if you have a situation like that?
Well, it's absolutely vital that you have that, either using a third party, and also like we had done, working with Hardin in the past, where we did some BPAT surveys, we called them. And we went out and actually found what do we have, did serial numbers, where they located, what are the hazards there, and those kind of things are good to help cities, you know, kind of get a hold on what they have and where everything's located at.
So again, if I'm a facility and I have a backflow assembly installed, does that automatically mean I'm protected?
Absolutely not. It depends on the health hazards there. It depends on, was it tested? It depends on what backflow we have. And it depends on, was there any changes or modifications done to the facility where we're at. There's a lot of factors there. But if I'm a utility, I want to try to keep up with, like I said, those kind of things. In a large city can be problematic. Let's just take the city of, the DFW area, where we have these large cities and thousands of backflows out there. I mean, they have quite a job, keeping up with all that.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. And we talk a lot about kind of the smaller utilities, right? About the challenges that they face. But you're right, our larger municipalities, just in volume and scale and type of hazards that they're facing, face an incredible workload as well. Well, Ron, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of my biggest takeaways is that a backflow assembly on a properly, or is that a backflow assembly on a property doesn't necessarily mean that property is protected.
Right.
And like you talked about, even if I have the proper containment assembly, I've got to protect those folks internally inside that facility. And so making sure I have the right level of protection at each point of use where we use water for different cross connections and hazards to protect the folks in those facilities is important. And the other thing is that these properties change over time and use changes over time, and we need to monitor that continuously. In our next episode, we'll move on to Pillar 4, testing, and we'll discuss how utilities manages notices, tester credentials, compliance tracking, and an ongoing challenge of keeping assemblies tested and compliant. Thank you for listening to FLO Talk, conversations with water professionals, and we'll see you next time.